Hi, I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff Mays sitting in for Sam Roberts. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, I'll speak with the producer of the Exit Interviews, a New York Times project focused on what's ailing Washington through the eyes of the lawmakers who have decided to leave Congress. But first, for the past 2 weeks, the world has been captivated by student protests breaking out on campuses throughout the United States. The New York Times has been covering the story with live updates on their website, as well as expansive video coverage on the ground. Senior New York Times video journalist Alexandra Eaton captured the unfolding drama at the Columbia encampment, while freelance journalist Liset Cruz has been providing live updates on student protests around the city. Welcome, Alexandra and Liset. Thank you so much for being here. I'm wondering if you could just, it's been quite a week, right? I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you saw at Columbia and where were you stationed during the protests?
Well, I had been going up, I began going up to the encampment and to campus last Friday, which was the day after, 2 days after the encampment was cleared and the first wave of arrests were made. Mainly to just get a handle on the situation, start talking to people, and give our viewers a sense of what it was really like on the ground, because I think there was quite a bit of misinformation flying around the internet and on TV about what the climate of safety was like on campus. So one of the first things we wanted to do is really dispel that notion. Because the feeling on campus was quite different than how it was being portrayed. It was very calm, very organized, very peaceful. People were snacking, playing cards, knitting. So a very, very different scene. And then I just kept going back every couple of days, and everything sort of culminated, of course, on Monday when the students mobilized and escalated an action against the administration and took over Hamilton Hall. So I was in front of Hamilton Hall when the students took the building over and was able to capture them zip tying the doors, dragging furniture over to barricade the entrances. And yeah, was really there in that moment to show people what it was like.
This feels like an important moment. Have you guys thought about that in terms of, the historical context of this, given the background of these protests being the war in Gaza? What are your thoughts on this particular moment? Was there a sense of where this falls in history and how important these protests are?
I think this is very similar to the protests we saw at Columbia during the Vietnam War. The students very much modeled their activism after the movements that occurred during that time. The students then also took over Hamilton Hall, I believe, and that's why I feel like I wasn't able to clearly speak with a couple of students that evening, but it seemed like they were just following the same not protocol, but the same plan of previous students before them. So I feel like this is very much a historical moment. It's worldwide attention on a very small part of the world, and it's devastating humanitarian crisis. A lot of people have died, and to see students react to that and really come together and protest against it is really moving. And I feel like this is for sure going to be a moment in history where people in the future are going to look back and know that the students mobilized to stand for a cause.
It feels like the protests at Columbia, Alexandra, maybe sparked other protests around the country. And today, the Mayor Eric Adams and police officials talked a lot about what they called outside agitators, quote unquote. And they released a number today that almost 47 or a little more than 47% of the people who were arrested at City College Columbia on Tuesday were not affiliated with the university. I'm wondering what you guys saw there. Was this a situation where there were outsiders coming in influencing the students to protest, or does this feel like a student-led movement from what you both witnessed?
Well, I think that those figures are always a little bit confusing because they don't really distinguish between what's happening right outside the gates of campus and what's actually on campus. Certainly earlier in the week, I myself witnessed lots of outside agitators who were standing outside the gates, people from other protest groups on both sides who basically came to Columbia to face off and yell at each other. But that is a very different group than the student-led movement that we had on campus. Certainly, there are a couple of people that were on campus who were not students. However, the assertion that they're somehow masterminding the protests seems very false to me. From what I witnessed, this was a very organized, student-led group that has been working together since early November to mobilize the students against the war in Gaza and to try and stop the war.
And Liset, you noticed too that a lot of the arrests at City College came outside of the campus?
Yes. Tuesday night there were two specific groups, right? There's people inside the gates on campus that were participating actively in the encampment, and there were people outside of the gates that were coming to support the students, right? But at this point, NYPD and other school administrators had shut down the campus. And I witnessed during two separate occasions that NYPD arrested multiple people outside of the gates. And I feel that those numbers are probably influencing the number of arrests that evening, and that's why that number seems so high. But I genuinely believe, and I agree with Alex, that this was a student-led movement.
There were some professors out there too, right, that were encouraging students. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the professors also earlier in the week on Monday, a group of about 200 professors stood on the steps of Lowe to protest President Shafiq's decision to bring the NYPD onto campus, and also the what they call the draconian treatment of the students, suspensions, not allowing them to finish the semester. You know, these students this is $30,000 at least down the drain if they're not able to finish their year out. So the consequences are quite harsh, and a group of professors, regardless of their political affiliation, have been intent on defending the students' rights. On the day of the Hamilton Hall mobilization, a group of professors put their bodies in front of the entrance of the encampment and linked arms to make a show of force against any NYPD incursion. So they've been very vocal about their support for the students' rights. And of course, famously, there's the University Senate also on Columbia campus, which is a group of students and teachers. This group was started in 1968, which was when the NYPD was brought onto campus. And this group was created to ensure that it didn't happen again. President Shafiq is required to consult with them before bringing any law enforcement onto campus. She did so, and they rejected her request. But she chose to bring them on anyway. So this group in particular is very, very upset about the president's steamrolling of their rights.
Right. So both of you got very chaotic on the campus there, and police were involved. They sealed off the area. How did you guys cover it? Were there police? Did they sort of impede any freedom of press? Were you able to move about? I know I've heard some criticisms about, the NYPD released their own videos, but independent journalists weren't necessarily allowed there while they were making arrests. What was your experience like?
At City College, during the arrests outside the gate, I also left the campus. So once I was out, I was not able to return. So I witnessed the scene outside. They pushed off onlookers, protesters that may have left the group not wanting to risk arrest, people in the community, and journalists that were in the crowd. They very forcefully moved people down the sidewalk, and I was part of that group, and I was wearing my New York City press badge. I was telling them, like, hey, I'm press. It did not matter at all. The force was there. They needed to move everybody off the sidewalk. And some of the officers seemed very ready to engage, holding on tightly to their batons, very aggressive, it seemed like. And earlier Tuesday afternoon, students at City College did attempt to take over a building, and during that I sprinted across the campus to catch up with those leading the run. And At that point too, NYPD officers were very aggressive. They used pepper spray on everybody that was near the entrance of the building. And I have video actually of one officer just saying, "Try me," with his hand on the baton. So it just seemed like they were very ready to engage. Yeah.
Right. I'm wondering too, Alexandra, do you think the tactics the student used, the encampment, sort of barricading themselves in buildings, the chains, I'm wondering do you think that affected the way police responded to the protests at all?
This was like a David and Goliath response. I would say, it took the students probably 20 minutes to secure the entrances to the building. It took the NYPD under 5 minutes to get in to the front doors, not on their contraption. So, they and there were hundreds of police on the campus that surrounded the encampment, blocked off all the entrances, made it very difficult for press to even witness what was going on. I myself was not able to be in front of Hamilton Hall when they actually entered because they had done such a brilliant job of restricting our movement. But, I think that they were prepared. It seemed like they were prepared for anything. But from what we can see of video of the arrests happening, it seems that, most of the people that were in Hamilton Hall walked out. So it doesn't seem like they were met with whatever they thought they were going to be met with.
Right. My last question I want to ask both of you, how did your own personal experiences, backgrounds influence your coverage of this event? And I'm wondering, did you gain any insight from talking to the students about their motivations in this protest? Certainly some of them were risking their academic future by participating in these protests. I wonder, each of you, if you could tell me a little bit what you saw, what you thought.
I feel like I have the perfect job because I love to just watch things happen. And I think, since October, I've been involved in covering this conflict in one way or another. And I really enjoy just like watching everything happen and trying to understand motivations on both sides for why people do the things that they do. But it's always, it's fascinating to try and discover what motivates people to risk so much, especially in this case. This is a group of students that is risking financial, this is a group of students that is risking quite a lot in order to save somebody's life that they've never met halfway around the world. So I find that incredibly moving.
What about you, Liset?
One thing I specifically learned during all of this experience is that transparency goes a long way. A lot of the students were not really willing to engage with media just because of everything that can be twisted and turned by other media. And I felt that I wanted to build a trusting relationship with the students, so I was a lot more transparent than I usually would be. I feel like during previous protests that I've covered, I just say my name and who I'm with, and I don't really explain further than that. But this time around, I kind of just said, like, I'm Liset with the New York Times. If you feel free to look at my previous coverage to make sure that they know that I'm a journalist that has been reporting on this for a while. I explained what I was there to do, the story that I was working on, and I explained the overview of the themes of the questions I would be asking, and also let them, skip a question if they didn't feel comfortable answering. So I feel that really went a long way with students. They were really receptive and really appreciative of that. I think at one point, prior to, I think it was late last week actually, no press was allowed in the encampment at Columbia during a point, and I was one of the reporters that was on some list that they had created, vetted reporters. So having that kind of access really has allowed me to grow as a journalist and understand and respect people's, when they do such huge movements. I think it's really important that you respect what they're standing for. Because in one case at City College, a cameraman entered the encampment, didn't really identify himself, just started walking up to students with his camera on his shoulder and said, "Are you willing to do an interview?" And then immediately the students essentially kicked him out. So I think, yeah, no, transparency definitely goes a long way. And I think the other thing is that seeing people risk their futures for something across the world is also really inspiring. You know, it means that there's something that's they care for something that is a lot greater than themselves. And so I think that the movement and having the different protests across the country inspired by Columbia, really shows that majority of Gen Z cares to make a change.
Thank you so much both for coming in. I'm looking forward to more of your insightful reporting. Coming up next, retiring lawmakers voice what's wrong in Washington. According to the U.S. House of Representatives' current casualty list, 48 Senate and House members, 25 Republicans, and 23 Democrats are retiring or seeking other office. Why the rush for the exits? The New York Times set out to discover what key factors were leading to their decision. Amanda Sue is the producer of the New York Times video project, The Exit Interviews, which examines the reasons why lawmakers are leaving Congress and what they have to say about its current state. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about how this project came to be.
Sure. So I think late last year, we've been seeing a lot of headlines from the New York Times newsroom about Congress members heading for the exits. And I think there was even an interactive article that was keeping track of all the departures. And so the idea for this project was conceived of in one of our weekly pitch meetings, where we decided that we should try to, catch these Congress members before they headed out and get a peek behind the curtain for what Congress is actually like.
Right.
And so we kicked off the process then, and then, it's been a long time since, obviously, but we were working on scheduling the Congress members, did the interviews in February, and then it was just published this week.
And tell me some of the questions you asked. Well, so I'll give you an example of some of the questions you asked. You said, is Congress corrupt? What's your most frustrating experience? The biggest perk of the job. Tell me the framework of the questions. What were you seeking to cover?
Yeah, it was tricky. We actually spent a long time agonizing over the list of questions because we wanted to ask the same ones to every lawmaker. We started actually with a list of 14 that we asked, and after the interviews narrowed it down to the best 8 responses. I think we wanted to capture a range of topics. Obviously assessing the state of the institution, which is what we get at with what's one word you would use to describe Congress today, but then also breaking that apart and getting into more specifics, like is Congress corrupt, getting at the idea of money in politics, also the congressional salary. The most frustrating experience question was meant to sort of get more personal stories and emotions, but we also wanted some more lighthearted ones as well. Obviously, it doesn't just completely suck to be a Congress member. There are perks, so we asked about that. We also asked about the congressional salary, and of course the big question of how do you fix Congress so that they could help us diagnose the problems and also the prescriptions and how we get out of them.
I'm wondering was there any particular question that led to great insight or surprising answers?
Yeah, I would say definitely the salary question. For me personally, at least, going into the interviews, I had a pretty stereotypical perception of a Congress member in my mind. I'm not a Hill reporter or politics reporter by trade, and so it was really interesting to hear the Congress members talk about how difficult and straining the job can be for them, traveling between their home district and Washington, D.C., which is a very expensive city to live in, and what it's like trying to maintain 2 households, 2 cars, 2 wardrobes in 2 different cities. And while their salary, $174,000, isn't exactly low, it is difficult and prohibitive for especially lower income people who can't afford to run for office and maintain this lifestyle. So it got into really important questions of access as well.
Yeah, I too like the salary question. As someone who's covered politicians, it's the most sensitive issue. You talk to them about that.
Yeah.
But none of them actually gave a dollar amount that they thought they should make. Why do you think that is?
It's funny, we actually were curious if any of the Congress members knew their own salaries, and so we wanted to ask for the dollar amount. We actually pressed for it, and I don't think a single person gave us a direct answer. It's hard for me to say exactly why. I think it's probably because they just haven't maybe done enough thinking to be able to put an exact number. They offered suggestions for how the salary could increase, like inflationary adjustments or cost of living adjustments, and kind of put it on those experts to figure out what those adjustments should be.
Another of my favorite questions was, is Congress corrupt? What did they say?
That one's a funny one because in the video clip, a lot of them start off the interview saying Congress is absolutely not corrupt, and they go on to explain all the reasons why Congress is corrupt. Yeah, it's funny. I think that the main thing that they all talked about is just the role of money in politics, calling for campaign finance reform, how much effort politicians put into fundraising, and how little time that leaves for actual lawmaking. One Congress member, Congressman Ken Buck, who actually resigned early, he talked about how Congress members have to buy committee seats. Essentially, whoever can fundraise the most can get the best, most powerful committee seats and gavels. And so one of the Congress members, Senator Ben Cardin, he also mentioned the Citizens United Supreme Court case, which basically opened the floodgates of corporate money into politics and elections. And so clearly there are a lot of reasons people laid out for why Congress is maybe not corrupt, but often influenced and beholden to, special interest groups and outside corporate interests. And they did offer some perspectives on how we can sort of fix that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the responses I heard from a lot of them was it was up to the American people to fix Congress. What did you take that to mean?
Yeah, my interpretation of that question or that response, which we got from a few people, is that the polarization and dysfunction in Congress originates with the problems that we're seeing in just American culture more broadly. American culture and the American population is becoming more polarized, more divided. It's kind of a chicken and the egg problem because it's hard to say if that's because of politics and our politicians or if our politicians are simply responding to trends happening in the American public more broadly. But what they said was that the American people have to try to be more civil and work across party lines and ideological divides, and as a result, the people who run for office will reflect those changes. I think that's a very optimistic take and also doesn't quite give a very specific solution or concrete fix that could be undertaken right now, but I do think that some of that is mirrored in the work that Congress is trying to do in trying to reach across the aisle and bridge those partisan divides.
And you spoke to both Democrats and Republicans. Right now our former president is on trial. I'm wondering if there was any discussion about how President Trump, his presidency, and some of the norms that changed around our politics has affected Congress at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was interesting that President Trump didn't come up as much as I thought he would. The main context in which he came up, and I think the only place where he's mentioned in the videos that we published was in response to the question, what was your most frustrating experience? And Congressman Tony Cardenas, he specifically called out Donald Trump and said that his own personal biggest frustration is the fact that the Republican Party seems so beholden to President Trump that basically whatever he says goes, and it makes it impossible for there to be any kind of compromises reached because he's basically the leader of the party and there's no getting around that. I think that sentiment was echoed in a lot of the other interviews that we did, but his name specifically did not come as much as I thought it would.
Did you notice any patterns emerge from the Congress people about their responses on the future of Congress and how to fix Congress?
Yeah, I think in terms of fixing Congress, a lot of them thought that, like I mentioned, it starts with the American people. They were very optimistic about the younger generations who are going to be entering politics and running for office. One of them, Congressman Dan Kildee, something interesting that he told me was he felt that young people were more ideological and political, but they were less partisan, meaning that they identified less closely with specific parties, but as a result could maybe counterintuitively work across party lines better if there were specific issues they cared about versus specific parties that they were loyal to. And so I think that that was one thing that they indicated as not necessarily being a fix, but at least a source of optimism. And then we were actually lucky enough to interview Congressman Derek Kilmer, who chaired it's a long name, Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, also nicknamed the Fixed Congress Committee. And so he was able to share a lot of really great insights into the work that they were doing and recommendations they came up with for how to make the Congress less dysfunctional.
30 seconds. I'm wondering if you are, after this project and talking to these Congress members who have, hundreds of years of experience, I'm wondering how you came out. Are you more or less optimistic about the future of our Congress, about our democracy?
Yeah, I would say it's a little mixed because I'm encouraged by the fact that there are this many Congress members, a small subset of which that we spoke to, who are just really thoughtful people who really did genuinely seem like they, ran for office and wanted to do all this for the right reasons and were fighting for their constituents. So I was really encouraged by that, and it was great to meet them and speak with them. But the discouraging part is the fact that those are the ones who are leaving and heading for the exits. So I'm sort of curious to see with the Congress members who are still in office, who are running for re-election and also newly running for election, what the makeup will be like, and where we go from there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this. Be sure to check out Amanda's piece at nytimes.com. That's it for today's show. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Mays, filling in for Sam Roberts. Join us again next week on CUNY TV.